Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Chellam, welcoming you to another podcast of ours. Today, we're going to talk to the author of a book that is subtitled The Truth About How Bad Medicine and Lazy Science Leave Women Dismissed, Misdiagnosed, and Sick. Maya Dusenbery is the author of Doing Harm. It's an awesome book if you have not read it. She was a part of our fatigue summit, and this is the conversation I had with her. It's an amazing book because it talks of the journey that we all see for ourselves, as well as a functional medical doctor. Most women come to me after they have been dismissed by their doctors for almost a decade, if not two. And they come in with a multitude of symptoms, which was all ascribed to them being anxious or depressed and not to a real medical cause. So this book really opens up our eyes to this practice of medicine. And we get to speak a little deeper into why this happens, what can be done about it, and what do women need to do different to be heard, to be seen, and to be understood, so that their medical issues don't get out of control before they die. So for those of you who've been struggling to get answers and who have lost faith in the medical system and have turned to Google University and are actually making things worse for yourself, this might be that conversation you want to listen to. As always, remember, download this podcast, share it with someone, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And also very important, remember, the reason I do this podcast is to connect people with somewhat of the truth that they need to be aware of, number one. Number two, also understand how to navigate the medical system. It is not medical advice, it's purely informational, and to some degree for my entertainment, and for you, hopefully it is information. So welcome again, and let's, without any further delay, listen to what Maya Dusenbery has to say about how to be heard. So welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time out.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Maya, one of the things I want to get into is you're not related to the medical field, correct?
Correct, yeah.
And when you started your journaling, what kind of issues were you actually interested in?
Yeah, so I've been a feminist journalist for a while, and so I've covered kind of a range of women's issues, including a lot of reproductive health issues, and I have sort of background in that area. But as you know, a very healthy 20-something, I really hadn't interacted with the medical system all that much, and hadn't really given too much thought to it until about 6 years ago when I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. And that was kind of the start of this path towards what ultimately culminated in the book. And started just kind of thinking about, how well equipped the medical system was to care for me if I actually got sick. And I was inspired by learning a lot about the experiences of other autoimmune patients and finding that so many of them have these long diagnostic delays and often went to many doctors, and were really kind of had the sense that they're dismissed or misdiagnosed during that time. And so the book was really an attempt to understand why stories like that seem to be so common, what the history was, what the kind of systemic problems within the system are that kind of explain that.
So just to back up a little, so you got diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, but how did that lead you into understanding that there are other people who get diagnosed, but there's a delay in their diagnosis? Did people just approach you, or did it just something that you experienced?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I was sort of inspired to do was just learn about autoimmune diseases generally. Once I was diagnosed as a journalist, I, of course, wanted to kind of learn as much as I could about RA, but also about this epidemic of autoimmune disease more generally. So I think the first kind of light bulb moment was thinking, why are these conditions that are so common, that are increasingly common, and that really disproportionately affect women, why are they not more widely recognized in the medical system and also in the public more broadly? Why do we not sort of talk about an autoimmune epidemic in the same way that we talk about diabetes? So that, I think, was the first kind of realization. And then through that, just sort of reading stories or hearing from other women, just my peers and friends who were dealing with not just autoimmune diseases, but a range of conditions, who were telling these stories of really just, at minimum, just frustrating experiences in the medical system, and at its worst, just really kind of traumatic near misses where they were misdiagnosed.
So to understand, so when you got diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, is it because you were diagnosed so early, or you had never heard of it before, and you wanted to know more? What made you kind of delve into, hey, I want to know a little more about why I'm having this? And then when you started talking and people said, oh yeah, I've had this too, and you're lucky that you got diagnosed and you didn't have to suffer for years. Because if I remember right, when I read the book, you woke up one morning with a lot of stiffness and pain, and your primary care was actually very, on top of things, where she said, hey, just come back to me, we will repeat the test. And it was like a 6-month period when the test results were actually positive and you got a diagnosis. Am I right?
I had a pretty kind of classic onset of RA, where I started having joint pain in my hands shortly after getting the flu, and then it sort of gradually spread to all the joints in my body. But yes, as you say, I sort of very early, within weeks, went to my primary care doctor, because it was, as a healthy 27-year-old, not normal for me to have joint pain, and so I was immediately concerned about it. And she, at that point, my blood tests were not positive, but she did tell me, it could be that it's just early on, so come back if it doesn't get better. And it was such a clear kind of worsening over the course of 6 months, that I eventually went straight to a rheumatologist. And at that point, it was, I had clear blood tests that showed it was RA. And myself, I had a really pretty straightforward path to diagnosis, and was lucky that it was diagnosed early, so I got early treatment, and no doubt in part because of that, my symptoms have been in remission for years. I think I can only attribute it to my sort of natural curiosity, and my feminist background, where I was, I knew that these conditions do disproportionately affect women, and just realized that I hadn't really given a lot of thought to why it is that a lot of women's conditions that are broader than reproductive health are kind of neglected and under-researched in medicine. Because I knew from my background that, I had focused a lot on reproductive health, and had kind of just overlooked the fact that, of course, women's health encompasses so much more than that. There are conditions like autoimmune diseases that disproportionately affect women, and there are these sex and gender differences for the same condition that we're really only just now starting to kind of acknowledge and recognize.
So what did you, when you started doing the research, you were very young, does it run in your family? Was it a shock to you that you had rheumatoid arthritis?
Yeah, it doesn't run in my immediate family. I think I had a great aunt maybe who had it, but we don't have much autoimmune disease, actually, so it wasn't something that was on my radar.
You basically didn't have the excuse of it's in my genes, therefore I had it. So that's why, that could have been the other reason too. You were asking questions, how did I get this? Right, were you able to find some answers from your doctors at that time?
Not necessarily from my doctors, but certainly I got pretty interested in reading a lot of the emerging research on the microbiome. I had taken antibiotics pretty close to when I was diagnosed, so I believe that probably had a role to play. Was also vitamin D deficient after a long year of a pretty stressful job and not getting outside enough in San Francisco. So, I think just, as a curious person, really did want to understand why this happened, why it happened when it did, and was pretty frustrated to kind of run up against the fact that, the average rheumatologist is not necessarily thinking in that way. They're prescribing the meds and hopefully they work. But that sort of intellectual digging to find the root causes was something I kind of ended up doing more on my own.
Correct. So one of the things that really becomes very apparent, and you'll find this as the decades, because now I've been a physician for about little over 2 decades. There was a time when patients totally trusted the doctor. Whatever we said, they would do. So if I said jump off the bridge, they will jump off the bridge. There are a few groups of people who are still like that. They have this attachment with their physician. Now, over the years, over the last 5 years, people have access to information because they can scour the internet. Now, I'm not saying all of that information is accurate, but it gives them a different option. They begin to think about, hey, I don't want to know what I have, I want to know why I have it. Mm-hmm. But when you look at this traditional medical system, our training, our job as physicians has always been to minimize a patient's suffering. And so when you come in with a pain, my goal is to see what can I do to get her to feel better. I'm not thinking of that, why does she have it, right? And you did a very good job in this book where you explain the various reasons why physicians don't ask those questions. And a lot of it is just what we have learned, our limited vision. But I think the bigger issue, which I was very kind of shocked by, is the trust factor, right? Where they don't trust that what the patient is saying is actually what the patient is feeling. And there was a particular story that you said about Maggie. I don't know if you remember that one where she had the abdominal pain, and it brought back memories about my own experience. And I was a freshly graduated medical, I would say a freshly graduated doctor. Just finished what we call MBBS, that's what we get in India, that's a degree. And I was married. And we get married very early, like, arranged marriage. Went away from the state in which I was born. And I started having abdominal pain. And it would stop me in my tracks, where I would just stop and I'd say, I have this pain. Then I will look around and I'd say, if I just pass a little gas, I'll feel better. It was one of those pains. And then after about 3 weeks of that, I'm like, there's something really wrong. And I was potting forever. I was just in my early 20s. And I remember calling my mom. Those are the days when we didn't have cell phone and computer access. We had to do what is called a trunk call. I said, you know what, I want to come home. I'm just not feeling too good. And I remember seeing the obstetrician, the gynecologist, who was actually my professor in medical school. And he looked and he said, she's young, she's just got married, she's left home, she's anxious. I don't think there's anything really happening. We'll just do a laparoscopy, because my mother said, no, I know my daughter, she just looks gray and sick. So about a week later, he schedules it and they do the laparoscopy. And I'm anticipating a laparoscopy under sedation and out. And when I wake up, they have this excruciating pain. It's a huge scar. They actually found blood clots because I had a ruptured ectopic. So I went on for about 6 weeks. So Maggie's story was very similar, where she went in with abdominal pain and they kept telling her she was anxious. So that's really what most women face when they go in with a complaint, particularly where the doctor cannot examine or do tests and see, hey, I can see exactly why you have this problem. So if we cannot see it, we tend to get frustrated because we don't have answers. We're not able to end your suffering. So the best way we can feel better is to say it's all in your head, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you bring about in a lot of the conversation in this book. So women who have these issues, what would be your advice? What are the steps you have taken for yourself And what have you seen most successful patients take when they have a symptom? Hey, this is how I want to approach it. What is the conversation you think that will help them get to what they need to feel better?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that's so difficult is that it does seem like women are really caught in a lot of catch-22s, where if you are in that position where you're reporting subjective symptoms like pain or fatigue or anything else that can't be confirmed via a test, and tests or scans are not showing anything objective wrong, I think it is very difficult if the doctor has kind of decided to put you in that box and dismiss you as anxious, or, you know, any number of kind of similar labels. You know, I mean, in the example of Maggie, she was seen as this anxious college student, but by the end she had been kind of moved to the category of drug seeking. She was accused of
Yes.
making up her pain entirely because she was thought to be seeking killers. I think that one of the problems is that once you've been sort of written off like that, you know, almost anything you do can sort of reinforce that perception. You know, if you insist your pain is at a 10, you might just be written off as hysterical. And you know, so I think it is, we do need to acknowledge that it's hard for individuals to kind of navigate that. Some of the things that the women that I interviewed said were helpful. One was bringing a male partner, or, you know, a husband, even a son, father, with them to their appointments to sort of just reinforce that their reports were accurate. They were really sick. And, you know, I think that's, you know, in this day and age, it's very depressing that should be required. But a lot of women did say that they found they were treated very differently when they had that male kind of companion.
It's really sad. It's really sad.
It is, and yeah, of course, it shouldn't be like that. And you know, I think one of the things that a lot of doctors said in my interviews was, you know, the importance of really specifically naming how your symptoms are impacting your daily life. You know, so instead of just saying vaguely, you know, I'm fatigued, I'm tired, since that's this amorphous thing that can't really be pinned down, you know, saying I'm so fatigued that I can't, you know, fold the laundry, or I can't make my kids breakfast, you know, and showing the ways that you're functionally impaired by the symptoms. You know, and I think same with pain probably would be really useful, because pain is another thing that's just so subjective that you really do have to kind of trust the patient's report. So those would be my big tips. But, you know, again, as I say, I think it is very difficult. And, you know, a lot of women kind of have different stereotypes that impact them according to various other aspects of their identity. So, you know, a lot of the stories in the book speak to the idea that, you know, the Black women, for example, would be much more prone to being seen as drug seeking, because we have these very strong stereotypes about that. Overweight women often tell of having kind of every symptom just blamed on weight.
Yes.
To lose weight and that will fix everything. So there are, just a range of ways that women can be dismissed. But I do think that they all sort of at root come down to this lack of trust in their report.
What about educated women? Did you see anything in your research that well-educated women who would be able to articulate their issues seem to get as much care as a man did?
I mean, I think that obviously well-educated women have a lot of privileges that can help them in comparison to less educated women. But I do think that there are also stereotypes that can impact them. So, you know, a lot of, you know, I'm trying to remember who it was in the book, but it was a woman who was suffering from cluster headaches and trying to get and
migraine, getting diagnosed with migraines.
Yes, she was just told it must be migraines. You're a woman, they're migraines. And she had a partner who was in the medical system who said, you know, you should track your symptoms, and it really sounds like they're not migraines, they're cluster headaches. And so she came in with her, you know, data. She was well educated, and she was clear. She very much felt like she was written off as this overeducated woman who needed to get off WebMD, who, really kind of inspired this resistance in doctors precisely because she was educated. And so there was a sense that, you think you know better than me, and I have the MD here, So I think that is a danger that a lot of really educated women kind of have to walk. And, a lot of women I spoke to, and I've sensed this myself in the medical system, really feeling like you have to at once advocate for yourself and show that you are educated, while, respecting the doctor's ego enough to not kind of antagonize
Right,
them.
right.
Yeah.
So one of the things I tell patients to do is don't talk to your doctor like he or she is your friend. This is still a business relationship. So you walk in and you have to say, the way women sometimes complain is, I don't know, I feel so tired. I think it's the age. I think I'm just too stressed. I mean, when you start putting in things, so you want the attention, when you start you're trying to minimize because you don't want to sound like a pain, the doctor doesn't take you seriously. But if you go in and say, you know what, till last year, I had no problems. I was able to do my after school activities with my kids, was able to do dinner. But this year, I just don't seem to have the energy to do it. Or I'm not sleeping as well, and I don't know what it is. I've had the same level of stress. I've been eating the same foods. Nothing has changed. When you're very specific, and before anything else, even as you walk, and if you see the doctor's very busy, I think you should point that. I know you're very busy, but I have a list of concerns that I would like to address. Do you have the time for me? So it's probably going to be very important to actually be open with that observation, where you're afraid to say, hey, my doctor is busy, I'm so scared to ask him any further questions or her any questions. The same with men and women. I don't know if you mentioned, a lot of women too get put off by women doctors, because a lot of times what we say is a patient comes to me and says, oh my God, my hair is falling. I know that's true. I'm your age. My hair is falling too, right? We immediately minimize that. It's like, once again, you don't want a physician who's telling their side of the story and overshadowing yours to make you feel better. So I think the conversation has to be very businesslike. You have to be very clear. In fact, coming prepared for your appointment. A lot of things that happen is where patients are coming in between their lunch hour, trying to get a quick, I want to talk to you about this. Make it certain that this problem is important for you and you would like their attention. So I think that's very important in the conversation. The other thing that you did bring up, which there was one particular study, I definitely want to bring that up, and I want to ask you which one it is so I can look at it, is the knowledge gap. The knowledge gap, which was the very first one, where you talk about most of the studies incorporating men, and then we extrapolate the results for women. And even as recently, I think as 2016, when they said, hey, we got to include more women, you don't think there's enough of an effort put into evaluate women, correct?
Yeah. I mean, in the U.S., this kind of knowledge gap was first put on the radar in the early 90s, and there were congressional hearings, and we got a change in federal law to ensure that at least NIH-funded research at the phase 3 stage has to include women, and theoretically needs to include enough of them to be able to do an actual analysis by sex or gender. So there's certainly been progress made in the last few decades, but yeah, it wasn't until 2016 that the NIH said, we really need to have this attention to sex differences in animal research too. And so now it's the same kind of standards apply to animal research and preclinical research. But until then, the bias has overwhelmingly been to use male mice in animal studies. And, all of that, of course, lays the groundwork for future drug development and findings in clinical research. And I think the other big problem is that, experts in this kind of say that there's been this add women and stir approach where women are included now most of the time, but we're still not necessarily getting those analyses done to actually see if there are any differences between men and women, and getting that kind of analysis published in the published articles about the research. So I think there is still this huge knowledge gap that then is kind of made worse because a lot of the research that has been done that has explored these sex and gender differences has yet to really be incorporated into medical education. So there's still this sort of long lag time, which is, not unique to this issue by any means, but does mean that a lot of doctors today are still getting taught a body of medical knowledge that is kind of skewed towards just knowing more about men's bodies, their conditions, how they will respond to drugs, the various differences in their experience of the same disease. So there's a lot of good data now in the realm of cardiovascular disease about sex differences when it comes to symptoms of a heart attack, response to treatment. It's really just been in the last few decades that we've started to kind of close that gap. So there's still a long bit to go.
Because, one of the studies that you mentioned was in 1965, I believe, where they tried to look at whether estrogens were protective, the natural estrogen was protective for women in heart disease, and they actually enrolled 8,000 something, 134 men to see the impact of estrogen on heart disease. How do they even design a study like that?
Yeah, I mean,
was actually done and reported?
I believe it was, yeah. I think the idea was sort of like, well, women have estrogen, they seem to have this protective effect. We want to kind of give that to men. Let's see if just giving estrogen to men would have the same.
Wow.
effect.
And there were men who were willing to take estrogen.
I guess.
Okay. Well, so that was a very interesting part. The other things in your pertaining to fatigue was the ME/CFS, right? The myalgic myalgic encephalopathy and chronic fatigue syndrome. Oh.
Yeah, myalgic encephalomyelitis.
Myelitis, and with chronic fatigue syndrome, which is actually a relatively new nomenclature for a condition that has, I think it peaked in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, and now we're also seeing quite a few folks who actually struggle with it, and usually comes after some kind of an illness, and they're never the same again, and nothing ever shows up in their tests. And a lot of times they struggle for years. Before, multiple sclerosis used to be one of those, where we could never get a diagnosis. I think more physicians are in tune with, for multiple sclerosis, when people come in complaining of lead-like leg or not able to walk, they do look for MS. But something like with the chronic fatigue syndrome, I think it's still a mystery, and it's still very difficult to get a diagnosis. What did you find in your research? Because I came up to that chapter and I didn't see what was the research you put in to find out what is actually happening in that field. And rolled into that, you had brought in Lyme's and the borreliosis and the Bartonella and all those rare infections that we never look for in traditional infectious disease specialty, but we don't even consider them as relevant. But actually, people struggle with these things. So could you just elaborate a little on what you found, and what do women do when they struggle with these conditions and can't find a doctor who will actually listen to them?
Yeah, absolutely. So this whole chapter was focused on, contested illnesses, these conditions that are still very marginalized within mainstream medicine that, historically were thought to be psychosomatic. I argue that because of that, there has been this lack of research devoted towards really understanding what's going on. So there's been this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where, the medical community sort of broadly has assumed that, this is this mysterious condition. We can't kind of find a clear mechanism that explains it. it disproportionately affects women, therefore it must be some psychosomatic condition. And it's not worth studying. So, and I think ME/CFS is a really perfect example of how this has happened, where when it kind of came on the radar in the 80s, in the media, it was dismissed as yuppie flu. Sufferers were really kind of stereotyped in these very sexist ways as, just like overworked moms or, depressed empty nesters. And in the research community, it became this condition that nobody really wanted to touch, because once the kind of consensus was that there was no real disease to see here, it seemed like a waste of research money to throw towards it. And so it's gotten remarkably little research funding over the decades, even though it's, fairly common, and at this point is so poorly understood that the most severely ill sufferers are often bedbound, most of the time, often can't even get to the medical system because they're so ill, and yet are sort of invisible both to kind of the medical system and the public more broadly. But I think there is really exciting new kind of directions in that field. Jen Brea's documentary, which came out on Netflix, I think last year, is called Unrest, which gives a very powerful kind of peek into the life of a few severely ill ME patients. And there's lots of very exciting research being done in the US at least, but again, just not enough of a investment in that kind of research. And I think, you might be able to speak more, but I think there is more and more awareness among the average physician that this is not just, a form of depression or some sort of psychosomatic condition, but that this is just a very poorly understood, very severe neurological and immune condition that we need to do a lot more research on.
Right. And the challenge is these conditions do exist and a lot of people know, but we don't know in traditional medicine, our education does not tell us what we can do different. And this is where the system puts us into a box. Like if I were to ask for a test above and beyond what I would normally do for, which would be covered by insurance, there are two major challenges I come across. Number one is the deductible that the patient has to pay for anything extra or anything out of the way that I want to do in order to get to the answer. And the other is the insurance not wanting to pay for a lot of the tests. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of stuck. And, a lot of times I tell people, if you look at what is your most important asset, it's your health. You have health, you have everything. You can make everything. You can make more money. You can decide to do, whatever you want. But we have become indoctrinated to think, if my insurance covers it, then I will do it. And what I also find is we are willing to put ourselves through testing, let's say CAT scans or MRIs, because I don't know how to find this, anything that the insurance will cover, which actually costs, they're in the hundreds of dollars, but it's because it's a covered, entity by insurance, you're willing to subject yourself to those things. But a simple, elaborate blood test, which may be a couple of $100, people will skip over it. They don't, because it's not covered by insurance. So a lot of it is the education of the public, the education of the physician. Is my job is to order the test that you need. My job is not to worry about what your insurance will cover and not cover. After that, we can deal with it. Just focus on what needs to be done for the patient, and then figure it out as how do we help the patient utilize what they've already paid into the healthcare system, the healthcare dollars to their, their well-being. And sometimes it may not be feasible, and it would be an understanding between the patient and, the physician, hey, these things have to be done. Let's do it, but we got to find answers. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, first is I still think there's a huge knowledge gap. I do have medical students who come through my clinic, and I'm really surprised as how how much of the mainstream diseases they learn about, cardiovascular, cancer, congestive heart failure, and very little of how to deal with when patients come in with complaints. In fact, I did my board certification. Every 10 years, we have to take our board certification, and I did my last one in 2016, which was 3 years ago. It was the most painful thing I could ever do, because I had transitioned to the integrative, holistic, get to the root cause medicine. And one of the slides was about a young female. She's coming, so these are multiple choice questions, right? But here's a young female who's had multiple complaints, has had multiple testing done, and nothing has been positive. What is your next step? Multiple choice question. Number one, do further testing to see if you can find anything. Number two is review all of her test results and figure out what tests you need to repeat. And number three was like, don't do any further testing, because you're going to be encouraging her to think there's something actually wrong with her. So the best thing at this is reassure her and send her home. First of all, it is a female, and this is being taught as of 2016. And it still is one of the board certificates. And I remember posting it online and feeling the frustration. And I was hoping this will be the last time. I'm hoping in 2026 I don't have to recertify, because it's almost impossible to actually look at medicine that way, because that's how we're being trained. Number two, what you mentioned is, though we've made changes for it to become mainstream medicine, the average time is 17 to 25 years. And today, in today's world, it's the best time to be both a physician as well as a patient, because there's so much of information coming from the research world. Patients do not need to feel helpless. You just have to find the right doctor. If you really look, and I think a lot of your characters in the book actually did that. They hopped doctor to doctor till they found somebody who would listen to them and actually give them a solution, correct? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that patients don't realize. You just forget what your insurance will cover, forget what you think should happen. Go look for somebody who will listen to you and actually think, hey, we got to get to the root cause, rather than every complaint you give, here's another pill that will take away your headache, that'll help your back pain, this will help your sleep. And before you know, you're on 3-4 different drugs, but all your diseases also still remain, and new ones crop up. And I think that's very important. And even like when you talk about chronic pain, and when being sick is normal, is one of your chapters. What is when being sick is normal? Is that those people who don't know how to go find a doctor? Because I know I haven't come that far, so I can get a quick preview of what I'm going to read in the chapter.
Actually, no, that chapter is looking at a few different conditions, especially endometriosis, and other conditions that cause menstrual pain or pelvic pain, and the kind of story that a lot of those patients tell of going to the doctor, and first either themselves kind of feeling like this is normal, not having a sense that their menstrual pain, if it's
normal,
school, if it's so severe that they can't go to school, can't go to their job, that's really not normal. But because we kind of have this silence around menstruation, there's a lot of kind of lack of awareness about what is a normal period, how much pain is normal, and when should you be seeking medical attention because there might be an underlying problem. And then when they do enter the medical system, very often being told, oh, that is normal, it's just your period. So a lot of the chapter focuses on the kind of long diagnostic delays that endometriosis patients experience, often going 10, 12 years before they're diagnosed. But also, a range of conditions being kind of misdiagnosed as just female issues, if they are at all related to pain down in the pelvic area. Which, I think is sort of another way that women's symptoms get misdiagnosed and dismissed.
Right. So I would say to add to that, one of the things that we tend to do, it's not because we don't think it's normal, we know it's common. So many people suffer from it, so something that's common gets normalized. Mm-hmm. And I've been guilty of it too. So when patients come to us and I see, say, a high blood sugar, I'll say, oh, you just got a little high blood sugar, here's metformin. Mm-hmm. And I'm just telling them, I'm kind of minimizing that particular, the fact that they're becoming diabetic, and telling them, I'm giving them the message, hey, you have high blood sugars, here's a pill. I'm not talking about anything else. So, but if the same person came in and they had a lump in the breast, and now I'm worried about cancer, I have all this fanfare around it, and like, oh God, we got to do ultrasound, we got to get you to a breast surgeon, we got to get you to an oncologist, and everything comes in. I'm picking up the phone, calling the surgeon. So we tell patients what is important and what is not. So when you come with menstrual pain, you come with fatigue, we have normalized it because it's common. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times when you know it is not normal for you, you need to step up and question it and say, hey, this is not me and I want to be me. What do I need to do? Where do I need to go? What are my next steps? And I think that's very important. And it's also important for physicians. And one of the things I teach medical students is, remember, no patient lies. No patient is actually making up stories, and no patient is truly anxious. Now, I've had a job where I see patients in a jail system. And, sometimes there's drug-seeking behavior. But if I sit down and talk to them, you can see why they do it. There's always a why behind why they seek certain drugs, why they are trying to treat themselves, and they try to do it, in a way, expressing some degree of pain, some degree of anxiety, or some degree of depression. So finding the time at today's day and world and in the system, it's almost impossible, which has created this new movement of direct primary care, where physicians have actually broken away from the traditional medical system and started their own practice, so they can have the time, they can have patients who actually want to work with them as a part of their panel. And the other is the concierge medicine, where we are focused on spending more time, have lesser patients, so we can actually spend the time. And people will say that's for the elite, but if you really look at what your insurance is covering, it's very little. Everybody has a deductible. Till you meet your deductible, your insurance doesn't kick it. So what do you want to use that deductible for? If you have illness, try to get yourself well, instead of trying to go through the same testing and everything that your insurance will cover. I would say seek out the right questions. I think you should ask the right question. And that's why we're not getting the right answers, because we're asking the wrong questions, right? In terms of when diseases are fashionable, what does that mean? What diseases are fashionable, and what did you find in that? And what is a group of people that struggle with these? And how do they get help?
Yeah, well, this was a reference to, I think it was an article from the 90s that in a medical journal talked about, I believe it was multiple chemical sensitivity, Lyme disease, might have been fibromyalgia probably as well, and kind of labeled all of these as fashionable illnesses. So the sense was that patients were adopting these kind of as a fad, that they weren't real conditions, but that because of the media attention that had been given to them, patients were sort of attributing their symptoms to like the hottest new condition, So you can probably imagine by now what I think of that, but yeah, so that again is another chapter that kind of delves into these contested illnesses, and the ways that they have been very much dismissed, and I think very kind of sexist ways, as just kind of the invention of over-anxious women mostly, instead of taking them seriously and recognizing that they very likely are just, poorly understood conditions that we haven't studied enough to really understand their underlying mechanism. and that if we had invested more research funding in them, we would probably know more. But in the meantime, so many patients who have these kind of conditions, I think, are in this really hard situation where not only do they often have a long struggle to get diagnosed, but even once they are diagnosed, you kind of have this condition that isn't fully accepted as a legitimate condition by mainstream medicine. So once that's kind of written in your chart, that can often be a strike against you, even going to other providers who kind of interpret that as a sign that you have a psychosomatic problem or are hysterical in some way. And I think that can be a real barrier to getting care, not just for that condition, but for other things.
Any other. Yeah. And I think that's a very good point. It's very important what is written in your medical record. Mm-hmm. And I always, I've had this habit where I actually send the records after I'm done with the visit. And I've had patients call and tell, hey, you got this thing about my family wrong. And I would have actually had to go in and correct it, because sometimes it's what we listen at that point or what we interpret what the patient says. So I think that's a very important point where patients need to, number one, plan for their doctor's visits, actually speak in such a way that it is a business relationship, because truth be told, it is a business relationship today. If you're using your insurance, if your doctor stops taking that insurance, you're going to find a doctor who will take your insurance. So it's no longer where you have this long-term relationship with your doctor who knows you fully well. It's really right now, the way the world is, you're going to find somebody who takes your insurance, and I think we should extend it to you. You need to find somebody who will actually sit and listen to you. Mm-hmm. Number two, make sure you check your records. Number three, call the office after you get a testing done and say, hey, I haven't received any results, because you'll be surprised at the number of women who will say, oh, I didn't hear back from my doctor. I guess no news is good news. And they don't even ask about their test results because I know my doctor would have called me if something is wrong. If only they knew the doctor has 125 messages, and by the time they get to it, it's probably 2 months later, and then you're trying to say, oh, you did have something abnormal 2 months ago. So those are the very important things. So, if you look at today's the world, the medical world, do you think and you mentioned this a couple of times, there's not much funding to research these conditions. Do you think there will ever be funding? Because unless they find a drug that they can make and sell that will make them money, because there has to be some degree of justification for putting in dollars. Though I feel if they looked at the amount of the workforce that goes down, how many people are applying for disability or are not showing up at work because of chronic fatigue or pain, they might actually, somebody has to do that statistics to say, hey, you do need to fund and figure out these conditions. But do you think there will ever be a time and day from what you've researched that this is going in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there are certainly so many kind of disincentives. Certainly, the fact that so much of medical research is funded by the pharmaceutical industry is something that kind of warps our priorities in lots of ways. So I think when it comes to kind of advocacy for these neglected conditions, I think most of the effort has been towards, getting public funders like the NIH to see that it should be considered a priority, regardless of whether you can come up with a great pharmaceutical treatment. We need to just understand these conditions. But yeah, I mean, I think fibromyalgia is a good example where once they did develop pharmaceutical treatments, which are, not necessarily that effective, but one of the things that did was that it provided an opportunity for some re-education of physicians by experts to say, this is the condition, it's a real problem, it's a real biological condition, and so it really legitimated the disease in a way that it hadn't been before. So Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated. At this point, I think that a lot of these conditions are, unfortunately, the best source of funding is patients themselves, which is
Yes.
ridiculous, especially when we're talking about these conditions that are so disabling that many patients are not even able to work, and yet a lot of that funding is happening through patients.
Unfortunately, that is so true. I always say, if you're going to invest in your health, there's maybe initially you have to, because, as you said, there's not enough information about these conditions, but they're very disabling. Just because you're not going to die from them, there's not much that is going into it. And I think patients, first of all, need to be educated on how to stay healthy. And I think looking at physicians, most of us don't know how to stay healthy. We know how to diagnose a disease and connect it to a drug. And I think the key thing that is missing in this whole medical training is, what does true health look like? So when somebody comes to you with chronic pain, you give them pain medicine, they're able to walk, you're happy, but the pain comes back when the medicine wears away. Or for fatigue, for which there is no treatment, but you're telling the patient, I need you to go and exercise. I'm too fatigued to go and exercise. And if you don't have a drug, the only thing that we're happy, if you've come from 0 to 5, I don't need to be at 10, I'm good at 5 because I'm much better. I'd rather not be at 0. And I think optimizing health for every decade should be the goal of both the patient and the physician, and that requires a systematic approach. And as long as you're not walking into a doctor's office hoping that they have the magic silver bullet that's going to help you feel fabulous and take away your disease, I think the whole system will begin to change. And I always say the consumer has to change for the system to change. We have to ask different questions, so they have to come up with different answers and actually make us feel better. So if, as we wrap up, what would be the advice you would give to women? I know we went through that, how to show up in your doctor's office, what you should be doing, but let's say somebody is struggling with fatigue, has no finances. Do you know of any way that they can actually, get kind of help? What do they do? And obviously these are people who cannot fund themselves either. So what would you say are the best resources that they have out there?
Well, I think, the biggest piece of advice I have for anybody is just to seek a second opinion if you are being dismissed. One of the surprising things I learned in my interviews was how many women, even very educated, privileged women who, had a lot of authority in other parts of their lives, when they came up against that kind of dismissal from a medical professional, felt really kind of paralyzed by it, and felt like they couldn't push back, and felt like they started, second guessing themselves. Maybe it is just stress. Maybe I'm making too big a deal out of this. And I think that really speaks to the fact that, even though the doctor-patient relationship has changed so much in the last few decades, we still do grant a lot of authority to doctors. And it is very difficult to kind of trust yourself when you're being told that your testimony about what you're feeling in your body is not accurate. But I think it's just so important to do that, and hopefully, having resources like my book that kind of give the history and the context will help make that a little bit easier to feel empowered to do that. But I think, as we've said before, one of the problems is that a lot of women can't afford to get a second opinion or a third or a fourth, or, it's when it often takes, dozens, if not hundreds of doctor's visits. That's obviously not just an option for a lot of women. So for me, it always comes back to the fact that, as much as I want to give individual advice, I think that this really is a problem that can't be solved by individuals, and we need systemic change if it's going to change for everybody.
Right. And also, with the fact that in the book you do mention the diagnosis for men come in much faster than a diagnosis for women, and that's one of the things that I tell people is, how long do you want to, with put up with the suffering. You get to accumulate everything that you are willing to tolerate. And we have to have a degree of intolerance to symptoms. And when you have a symptom, really seek opinion after opinion. And if you feel like nobody's listening to you, and that's very important what's written in the medical document, because if somebody says it's psychosomatic or worried welt, which I've used that diagnosis in the past several times, but because there were all the test results were normal, but I didn't know beyond what I know from my traditional medical training at that time. So those things are very important. Check your medical records. Make sure you get reasonable answers to. And when you ask these questions, doctors will also begin to change. They'll say, you know what? I need to think a little differently. And that's how we slowly change the system. Because if we continue with this dogmatic relationship where, the doctor knows everything, the doctor will tell me what to do, but it's your body and it's your life, and it's something that you might be exposed to or you are doing that is affecting you, and it has to be a partnership. One has to educate the other. So I think that's what really is needed for this system to change, and for women to really end their suffering, like as they've done in every century, is they have to take the first step and say, enough is enough, and this is what they have to do. Well, thank you so much, Maya. And I just want to, before I wrap up, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you wish I did ask you?
I don't think so. I think that's a great note to end on, and I agree that we do have a lot of more power, I think, than we realize as consumers of healthcare. That was something that a lot of experts, really drove home to me, that, asking those questions of your individual providers and also kind of collectively sharing your stories of misdiagnosis, of these under-researched conditions, I think can really help kind of put this knowledge gap and this trust gap on the radar and help spur change into the system.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.